In the summer 2012, during Documenta 13, I attended one of Walid Raad's performance lectures, or rather guided visits, to accompany his more recent project, Scratching on Things I Could Disavow, a history of art in the Arab world. This paper is a reflection on one of the works composing that project, Appendix XVIII, and I will begin with a close reading of this archive artwork and follow through the story with which the artist presents it to the audience. I will then point out and mobilize some overseen material capacities that an archive, and this archive in particular, may assume. The plates that compose the project, hanging on a wall that has been extracted from its original location and transported from somewhere else, apparently, they compose a random selection of covers of dissertation theses on visual cultures, letterheads, first pages of old history books, installation instructions, scribbled notes of exhibition budget, etc. So this is a little selection of some of the plates that are shown in the project. And they all appear like random documents that are all found documents, according to the artist. So during the walkthrough, Raad explains how he's recently realized that the Lebanese civil war has affected not just thousands and thousands of people among the ones who were killed, injured, displaced, and traumatized. It has also impacted the very elements of art making, the building blocks of artworks, meaning colors, shapes, and forms. These elements, terrified by the lengthy internecine conflict, have escaped from their usual location and hid in documents that we could somewhat relate to the infrastructural knowledge and discursive production that usually surrounds artistic practices. Colors and lines have disguised themselves and found safe asylum in parts of letters, primary tones, and numbers. Now, as Raad goes on to explain, this collection of documents will prove particularly handy in the future as a repository of unreplaceable elements of art. Failing to preserve it would equal an irreparable loss. The artists yet to come will not have access to and will not be able to use those same colors and shapes. To provide some more context to his work, Raad openly refers to Jalal Tawfiq's concept of withdrawal of tradition past the surpassing disaster. Now, according to Tawfiq, in times of crisis, tradition is affected not simply at a material level, but also at an immaterial one. The most immediate consequence of traumatic war experiences, for instance, is a withdrawal of tradition from objects, buildings, and environments, a supposed detachment of traditional meanings from the reference. A documentation of such withdrawal becomes necessary in order to make the same object accessible in the future, when their cultural reference will eventually be resurrected. Now, Raad presents Appendix XVIII, this collection of documents, as a documentation of withdrawing colors and lines, and as a guarantor of the survival and possible availability of those colors and lines to artists in the future. Therefore, we could look at the selection of plates quite literally, and the element of literality will come back several times throughout this paper, as an archive on hold, apparently waiting for the reference of the stored objects to be resurrected in the future, a sort of quintessentially floating archive. However, in this case, the power acceleration of the fluctuation itself may be such to provoke some sort of ultimate detachment. The elements cannot be reassigned a meaning or reference in the future. In fact, they may succeed in their hiding plot and finally escape. Now, clearly the object archive is made of the actual object's documents, as well as the action of storytelling. The story that we are told, as it usually happens with archives, assembles the documents, except that in this case, that very story is at once evidently fictitious and presented as the content of a lecture. Now, these two elements combined together, the object document and the action of storytelling, reminded me by opposition of another of Raad's works. We decided to let them say we're convinced twice. That was produced in 2002 and is catalogued among Raad's files in the Atlas Group's archive, the Atlas Group being Walid Raad's previous project. As the artist explained during a conversation published on a catalogue of the exhibition Miraculous Beginning that took place at Whitechapel Gallery in London, That work was the result of the encounters among several disparate elements. First, the prints at the George Eastman House and the paintings at Albright Knott's Gallery that Rod would regularly visit when studying at Rochester University. Second, his experiments with chemicals and lines in the darkroom. And last, the daily conversations with his family back in Lebanon during the most violent years of the Civil War. Those disparate elements took a while to smoothly combine together. As the artist says, for some time the experiences sat on top of each other. When they did blend, they produced this set of photos shot from a hill in East Beirut in 1982 during the Israeli invasion. According to Rod's story, the negatives remained undeveloped for several years, and when he decided to print them, the resulting images were scratched with small patches of color inconsistencies, as the film had not been properly preserved. Therefore, on the one side, the case of we decided to let them say we're convinced twice, we have a set of images held up, but not quite, by discrete elements and events coming together in the field of vision. On the other side, in Appendix XVIII, we witness a sort of breaking down of composite systems back into discrete elements of art that manage to be just what they are: the color yellow, the color red, a straight line, an oblique line. Now, before delving a bit more into Rod's appendix, I shall briefly digress on Franz Kafka's own literary method to elude and defeat metaphors. On December 6, 1921, Franz Kafka wrote a note in his diary saying, "Metaphors are one among many things that make me despair about writing." His disappointment was directed towards writing's incapacity to detach itself from the necessity to represent images in the world in order to express anything. In their book on the minor, Deleuzian and Guattari argue that one of Kafka's strategies to fight back against metaphors and literature's symbolic function, there was the one of deploying metamorphosis. In Kafka's work, characters do not bark like dogs, they are dogs. Gregor Samsa does not behave like a parasite, he becomes an actual cockroach. He assumes all the physical features and develops all the needs and problems of a common insect. The use of figurative meaning is limited to a bare minimum. In fact, there are no longer representative images standing for or meaning something else, but just material bodies, one metamorphosizing into another. Now, this technique fits well in the concept of minor formulation, as Deleuzian and Guattari suggest. The minor comes about in a sort of cramped space, trapped in the midst of multiple signifying regimes, and harnesses this overload of codes and references, but turns them into fluctuating variables, and so breaks or sidesteps via infiltration the regimental power. In so doing, sound is radically deterritorialized. It stops belonging to the language of sense from which it derives, and goes back to being just sound, or rather noise. Words, or in our case, colors, shapes, and reflections, detach themselves from the reference and neutralize sense. It is a language that, as Deleuzian and Guattari would have it, moves towards its extremities and limits, or detaches from sense. Now, I would like to return to Rod's documentation of colors, forms, and shapes, bearing in mind this idea of metamorphosis or metamorphical movement, and its capacity for neutralizing sense. Looking closer at the movement performed by Rod's colors, forms, and shapes, we could make a few observations. So first, there is a withdrawal from existing artworks. This is followed supposedly by a panic running around, and finally hiding, not in new artworks, but in the visible and invisible infrastructure supporting art making. Now, if we completely ignore the representative level possibly implied in these movements and think of them purely in their physical dimension, material components of art supposedly leave the reference behind, the painting, print, or photo they were originally composing and contributing to, and are inserted in an improbable, future-oriented narrative that does not quite provide any new signification. Rather, the material components enter an intensive loop or circuit of transformation that describes a trajectory going from what the audience sees to the fictional story it is told and back, without ever finding a stable status. In this loop, we may imagine those same elements of art as vibrating, gaining speed, and detaching from sense. Now, if we refine our observation of such a trajectory, we may notice at least three kinds of metamorphosis happening simultaneously. The first corresponds to the transformations of colors and forms from building blocks of artworks to building blocks of documents. The second metamorphosis is performed by the plates themselves, which turn into places of rescue and asylum. And the third mutation, that is facilitated by the previous two, happens almost in place, meaning that forms, colors, and shapes in the plates go from being what we're told they are to what we see they are, that is, forms, colors, and shapes. Now, when observing the plates, it is almost impossible not to look for hidden lines and shades. The narrative that the artist presents to the audience draws attention toward the individual elements now composing the documents rather than to their frame content. Clearly, we do not know and cannot tell how these individual elements should be considered, as they're supposedly hiding. I suggest thinking this archive that Rad describes as always standing at the beginning of a historical process, right because the documents supposedly precede the event that they will refer to, as disguising or hiding unexpected capacities behind the one of literally storing. More precisely, these archives' storing function goes hand in hand with the one of neutralizing signification, and the two together activate another related capacity that is breaking documents down into discrete parts. Storing happens in a literal sense and via hiding, as an action. Each element is featured in the collection of documents neither to represent something else or a certain category of objects, nor to mark the trace of an event occurred in the past. It is present just for what it is, and yet pretending to be something else. Moreover, the hiding place or archival machine coincides with the intensive circuits of transformation that I mentioned above, and the favor and neutralization of signification. For one-to-many reason, then, no indexical system applies or can be organized, nor can any narrative be clearly sketched or pieced together. From this perspective, Rad's work resembles more a collection of densely punctuated instances that exist as discrete elements, a quality that we can certainly find in many other examples of archives. In this case, though, the mechanism put at work guarantees that when surveying the documents, we do not know what disguised element to look for exactly, how small they are, or how precise and refined our vision shall be, how much we have to zoom in or zoom out. In fact, we're not even sure whether what we're looking for falls within our human optical capacity, our human optical range, or outside, below or above it. As viewers, we may imagine these parts not as static points, but precisely in relation to their capacity for movement. By virtue of this thinking, the parts become present not just as discrete components, but also as discretizing forces. Their level of discreteness is unknown, and they constantly drift apart from each other. These are not simply discrete elements, but elements that are breaking down the plates, and perhaps we could say sense, as well as narrative and history, into minute pieces in a sort of cosmic undoing. As Alan Gilbert has noticed already with regards to Rad's practice as Atlas Group and his more recent endeavor scratching on things they could disavow, his work has a preference for drawing history, and clearly the history of the Lebanese conflict, as made of interruptions rather than continuities. What I propose here is to consider those interruptions not much from a macroscopic and extensive perspective, but rather from a microscopic and material one. Now, thinking outside of Rad's work and practice, a very good question, perhaps an absurd question, but a very good question may be, what could we possibly do with these broken down bits that do not reside on a stable ground, but rather on an exploded plane of reality composed of discrete pieces of matter and thought? Now, we could view them as constituting materials for a non-linear history, as well as they could fit Gabriel Tarde's treatment of monadology, but refining our observation, we might be able to see something else. A possible consequence of this phenomenon of discretization, and here is where things become a bit more speculative, perhaps the more interesting of consequences is the alteration of the number of depth dimensions for each individual plate. When looking at a frame, we see the frame itself, all its composing elements, and then the unknown composing parts of these elements down to a bottomless micro level. The depth dimensions shift in front of our eyes without ever settling on a known number. And again, this multiplicity of layers is the result of a crumbling down of frames and documents into heterogeneous bits rather than a pre-existing given yet to uncover. This archive, metamorphosized into appendix, holds also a surprisingly creative capacity then. The one that we're looking at assumes the form of an endless list of Borgesian memory that keeps unfolding into new dimensional levels and therefore constantly produces excessive quantities, a sort of more, that we could not previously expect. Thank you.